Angular Directives. So what is transclusion? Well, I've read about it in a couple different places, and it's always been something of an intimidating topic, and that's mostly because I think the word itself and the name itself is somewhat confusing. So to sort of dispel that notion, I thought I'd take a look at what the word actually means. So trans, and this is from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary online, trans basically means on or to the other side of, across, or beyond. Include is to make something or someone a part of something. So basically mashing those together, we have you take something from across the way, mash it together with something else, and you have something new. That's basically the idea. So nothing that complicated, nothing that scary. It's apparently a computer science term as well, and in that context it means the inclusion of part or all of an electronic document into one or more other documents, hypertext. So the result of transclusion appears to be a new thing that's created on the fly from various parts, right? So in the context of Angular, what does that mean? Well, it means that we extract a collection of DOM elements from one part of the DOM, copy them to another part of the DOM, and maintain their connection to the original AngularJS scope from which they came. So this is coming straight from the AngularJS docs, which are actually pretty good in this regard. That's a lot. I've highlighted a couple different words here. So one is extracting, one is copying, and then one is maintaining a scope reference. And those are three things I want you to keep in mind as we go through some of the examples we're about to look at. So first, what I've done is created a pretty simple directive. So this is a directive called myCard. It has isolate scope. So it takes three different parameters passed to it when it's invoked in the caller scope. There's a title, a picture, and some content. So all three of those are going to be passed to it, and then all it does in its template is basically render those things out. So no big deal, right? We've seen this 1,000 times. The calling scope basically invokes the myCard directive, so you can see the myCard tags, and then passes in all that information, the my title, my picture, and my content. In addition, it wraps some content called the enclosed DOM content. So just remember that that's there for now. If you actually go ahead and run this, what you'll end up with is something that looks like this. A title, some content, which is a giant string, and then this picture image. What you don't see is the enclosed DOM content that was there in the original HTML template. And why that is because the directive does what it's supposed to do. It basically goes, finds that spot in the DOM, and puts its template there. It replaces what was there. So the enclosed DOM content is gone. So this is great, and this is fine. This is directives, nothing new. What you note, though, is that that string that was passed as content is just a string. It doesn't have any styling. It doesn't have anything else. If you wanted to style that, how would you do it? Well, that's where transclusion comes in. So if I take another example, basically, I can look at the same exact directive. No longer am I going to pass in the content via that sort of attribute. And no longer am I just going to render out that content via those mustache tags. Instead, I'm going to incorporate the content from the original caller scope as stuff in between the directives tags itself. So before we had that enclosed DOM content, now we have some HTML. It's HTML that has a title, or an H5, and it has a paragraph beneath it. So basically what we're doing now is saying that this is going to be transcluded content that is available to the directive and that can be used by the directive and inserted by the directive into itself someplace. So how do we specify where that content is going to go in the directive? Well, that's where the link function comes in. So if you go back on the left, there's a link function there that now takes a fifth parameter. That fifth parameter is called the Trans Clewd function. And basically what it does is if you invoke that function, it returns the transcluded content to you, to the directive. And the directive can then use that transcluded content wherever it sees fit. So in this example, the directive itself is going to say, let me go find an element within the DOM that has a class called content. And you can see that sort of 2 lines above, basically, in that directive template. And I'm going to append to that, basically, this DOM content that was passed to me in this because of transclusion. And when I do that, I'm going to render out a new image, basically, that now has the top of that string, basically, is now an H5, and there's a paragraph beneath it. So what we've been able to do is basically say, I can use this directive, and I can pass it new arbitrary content that has HTML styling attached to it, and the directive is smart enough to be able to incorporate that HTML content into itself at some location. It's a little bit clunky right now because we're using sort of jQuery to go find a class, and then we're using the append sort of method to then append that transcluded content onto that element. It's a little bit clunky. And Angular basically has thought about that. And so they've provided a new directive called Trans Clewd. So if you look at the same thing basically using Trans Clewd, it's basically a directive that now, if you note, the div that used to have a class content that we targeted in jQuery to append this content to, now just has the Trans Clewd sort of attribute on it. So that directive basically specifies a target or a bullseye for your content to be appended to. So if you look at the actual sort of template in the calling scope, there's nothing there, no difference. It's the same exact thing. And your outcome is exactly the same. You have this formatted, styled HTML inserted into a target spot in your DOM where that Trans Clewd label is attached. So that's pretty great. You can do a lot of stuff with that. In this example, we're using static content. And I should say that there's a lot of ways that, or as you would hope, I guess, the calling scope is able to basically pass in any sort of dynamic content it wants. So if you have mustache braces that you want to use to be able to interpolate out content from the calling scope, you can do that. One feature of transclusion is that it basically has sort of a hybrid scope, if you will. It has a pathway through to that caller, and hence it can access scope variables from the caller in the directive, even though the directive itself has isolate scope. So that's a nice feature of transclusion. So in short, transclusion allows directives to pull DOM content from the calling scope into a directive itself. And then you're able to specify where to include that content in your directive, either by basically assigning a bullseye with Trans Clewd on an element, or by using jQuery to go find an element and append that DOM content as a child. Taking a look really quickly at the Trans Clewd source code, it's actually pretty much exactly what we did. You'll note the top is basically a ling function that has the fifth parameter called $transclude, so right here, right there basically. And when $transclude is incorporated, you can use that to get that DOM content. If you look down at the bottom, they're actually invoking $transclude. They're not using the return value as we did. They're actually invoking it and passing it a callback function. That callback function is called Transclude clone attach function. So it's a mouthful, but basically what that's doing right here is doing the same thing. It's basically finding the element, emptying it out, and then appending basically a clone. What is a clone? Well, that's basically another option that this transclude function allows. When you call it with a callback function, it passes a clone of that DOM content and not the DOM content itself, which allows you to basically use that DOM content wherever you want. Previously, if you use the return value alone, you'd get one copy, and the last place that you appended that DOM content would be the only place that it existed. Now, because of this cloning feature, you're able to use it wherever you'd like. So basically, in short, use Trans Clewd because it makes it a lot easier and it takes care of cloning for you. It allows you basically to use that content wherever you like just by slapping it on content in your directive. And it allows you to do it wherever and how many times you like. So basically, the benefits of transclusion are you can include arbitrary content from the caller scope. They can sort of input stuff into your directive, share the functionality that directive brings, but then also include wrapped HTML content. And that wrapped HTML content basically has the ability to access the scope from which it came, and hence it can be dynamic and access all of those variables. We've seen this all over the place, basically. ngRepeat, ngIf, ngSwitch. These are all basically implementations that use transclusion. And if you think about it, they're basically attributes that are on an element, and anything that occurs within those element tags becomes something that's repeated multiple times. So basically, going back to the original 3 bullet points, what we're really doing is we're just extracting some content from the original caller. We're basically making a copy or a clone of that in the directive and putting it in the directive's HTML template. And that content basically has access to the scope from where it came. So let me just direct you a couple of different references. The documentation is actually pretty good, but it helps to have some context for it. And so there's a couple of blog posts here and a talk that were really helpful in sort of contextualizing everything and giving some meaning there. So thank you.